Well, friends, it's 4 o'clock, right on time. So pleased to see so many of you here, and great to see many friends and colleagues and others who are joining us for the first time. Very welcome. I hope you feel very welcome to be with us today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Nicole, could I just check, is the sound coming through okay, or do we have good sound that way?
Sounds great, thank you.
Right. So my name is Peter Nottebohm, and I'm the General Secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches. I'm working here in the West End of Toronto from my home, and this is here the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And so that's my brief introduction. I'm also putting that information in the chat box there. And I'd like to give you a moment, actually, just a few seconds of silence, maybe a minute or not even. Please just introduce yourselves in the chat box to everyone who's here too. Anything you'd like to tell us about yourself. It might be just your name. It might be your name and where you're coming from. It might be your name and your church community, or any other thing that you'd like to just mention. But take just a moment to type in the chat box so that we also get used to using the chat box for information and questions and dialogue. Just take a moment to type it in and press send, and let's have a look at who's with us. Oh, Leanne, great to see you. Thank you for joining. I see them rolling in now. That's great. Lots of friends and colleagues. Oh, what a treat, Linda. Great to have you with us. It's going to roll by so quickly that I won't be able to mention everyone, but please take a moment to just tell us who you are and where you're coming in from. That's my kitchen dining room clock telling me it's time to move on. So again, great to have you with us. Just a word about the Canadian Council of Churches. So the Canadian Council of Churches responds to Christ's call for unity and peace. It seeks Christ's truth with an affection for diversity and acts in love through prayer, dialogue, and witness to the gospel. That's who we are, and that's how we define all the work that we do. There are 25 member churches of the Council in the Anglican, Lutheran, Evangelical, Eastern and Roman Catholic, Eastern and Oriental Orthodox, and Historic Protestant traditions, who together make up about maybe 85%, according to Statistics Canada, of Christians in Canada belong to one of our member churches. In something like 13,000 or a little more than 13,000 worshiping communities. So that's who we are here at the Canadian Council of Churches. And the Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group, who is hosting the call today or hosting this webinar, has been busy working for over 20 years on some of the most interesting cutting edge topics that I've ever been part of. And I just want to highlight some of the topics that they have dealt with or have addressed and reflected on theologically or from a policy perspective over the years. It started with genetic engineering, of course, patenting life, who owns life and who can own living organisms, especially when they've been genetically modified. Questions of faith and genetics, promises and perils, nanotechnology, genetically modified organisms, embryonic stem cell research got their attention for a number of years. Genetic privacy laws, synthetic biology, CRISPR and gene editing technologies, artificial intelligence and lethal autonomous weapons systems, otherwise known as killer robots. And today the topic is, of course, moral bioenhancement, faster, higher, more moral bioenhancement in Christianity. So I can confidently say that the group whose hands you're in today has many years of experience reflecting on some of these questions, and it always bring an interesting perspective. Before I hand this off to our host for the webinar, let me just invite you. If the work of the Canadian Council of Churches resonates with you and you'd like to make a charitable donation to the work of the Canadian Council of Churches, of course, that would be a very encouraging sign for the Faith and Life Sciences group and the Council. And you can easily do that by clicking on the link in the chat box for Canada Helps, our Canada Helps page, where you can make a charitable donation if you'd like, as part of your commitment to our mission and vision. Right, so that's the introduction. I'm very pleased to hand you off to one of the co-chairs of the Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group. The co-chairs are Dr. Moira McQueen and the Reverend Dr. Peter Kunert. And Peter is your host for the conversation today, but as I've mentioned before, you're in extraordinarily good hands under their leadership. So Peter, over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, welcome to our webinar today. And thank you, Peter, for the introduction. As you know, my name is Pastor Peter Kunert, and I am with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. And it has been my privilege to be a co-chair of this reference group for the last 3 years and the moderator today. Our webinar, of course, is Higher, Faster, Better, Moral Bioenhancement in Christian Thinking. Our panelists today are all members of our Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group. And I will say more about them later, but just briefly, our panelists today are Reverend Dr. Tracy Trothen from Queen's University, Michael Buttrey from St. Michael's and the Anglican Church of Canada, and Dr. Moira McQueen from the Canadian Catholic Bioethics Institute. A couple of housekeeping items, please. First of all, if anybody has any Zoom technical issues, please use the chat box and connect with either Nicole Rokas or Rebecca Ivanov, and they will try and sort those technical issues out for you. Second, the format we're going to be using is a presenter presenting for about 10 minutes and then a 5-minute Q&A afterwards. If you have questions for the presenter, please type them into the chat panel on the side of the webinar screen, and we will draw on your questions that are written there. Again, we will have 3 panelists, each speaking for 10 minutes. Each panelist will be followed by a 5-minute question and answer period. After the third question and answer period, we will take a 3 to 5 minute break in the webinar before coming back for the last half hour as a plenary question and answer period. We will use the last 5 minutes of that question and answer period to close the webinar, to give thanks for all who have participated, and this is already my plug for the end survey. We are all learning a new form of communication with this webinar. Please, we are grateful if you would complete the survey. I'm told it will take less than 3 minutes, and it will help us with future webinar planning. Okay. Our first presenter today then is Reverend Dr. Tracy Trothen, a professor of ethics at Queen's University, who is jointly appointed to the School of Religion and the School of Rehab Therapy. She is a certified supervisor educator in clinical spiritual health under CASC and a registered psychotherapist through the CRPO. She is the author or editor of numerous articles, chapters, and 9 books, with the most recent being a co-authored textbook with Dr. Calvin Mercer entitled Religion and the Technological Future, An Introduction to Biohacking, AI, and Transhumanism. This textbook will be released in 2021. Tracy will be opening our presentation, giving examples of different forms of biomedical moral enhancement, and then talking about some of the challenges of defining morality, particularly from a Christian perspective. Tracy, thank you for being a panelist today.
Okay, there we are. Thank you very much, Peter. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to see some familiar names too who joined us. So I look forward to conversation today. I get to introduce us to just a few of the technologies. So whenever you're ready with the slideshow, I'm good to go. Okay, next slide, please. And next slide, please. So we have a lot going on right now with enhancement technologies, and one of the enhancement technology areas that we have that we see being developed is that of moral bioenhancement. How do we make ourselves more moral? What a question. Is it moral to make ourselves more moral? We'll be exploring that question in these presentations. So there are several. If we could just back up a little bit. Thank you very much. There are several different domain areas. The physical, the affective, the cognitive, the spiritual, and the moral are all areas of enhancement. So the questions that we need to be asking, especially by engaging religion in the public square with technology and human enhancement, is what does it mean for us to be human, and what do we want to conserve about our humanity? What do our faith traditions say are important qualities of being human that we need to safeguard? And are there things about being human that our faith traditions might suggest we could make even better? We could do good, contribute to the good by co-creating to make it even better. At the heart of this, we have to ask the question of what it is that we really, really want. What is it that we truly value? Do we spend time looking at those values? How do we help each other to articulate and investigate those values? Next slide, please. So moral bioenhancement, why now? Well, human enhancement all around, like I was saying, is increasing. And the particular concern is that with cognitive enhancement, so enhancing our abilities to think, and right now we're seeing that most pronounced in AI, by AI helping us to process more information, to see more, to know more. And we're going to have other ways of increasing our abilities to think faster as technology progresses and computer technology progresses. How do we safeguard ourselves in the face of this powerful tech? So we're going to, if we get better and better at having the ability to create good things, we also get better and better at having the ability to create bad things, destructive things. And you'll hear Michael talk more about Pearson and Savulescu, who have written a lot about moral bioenhancements, and there's been a lot of pushback because they want to see us embrace moral bioenhancements for the purpose of protecting humanity and the planet. So I think they have a case, but the question is, how do we go about it, and what do we go about? So there are biomedical interventions that are hoped to improve moral reasoning, increase pro-social behaviors, strengthen motivation to do good, and or enhance moral virtues, and we'll consider a few of those. Next slide, please. So there are, there's evidence that there's a behavioral, genetic, and neuroscientific foundation for lots of our moral dispositions, including aggression. And that's why we call moral enhancements generally moral bioenhancements, because they have a biological basis and therefore can potentially be influenced by pharmacological agents. For example, Ritalin reduces impulsive aggression and can improve focus, including the ability to problem solve. So all these pharmacological agents are used right now for other purposes, and they're used quite well and effectively, and they've really helped us out. They can also be used to increase and improve our morality, our virtue. So how do we know for sure what the motivation is for using these things, and how do we make decisions around how to use them? Oxytocin is a particular example that I'll revisit briefly later, but it's promoted as potentially increasing pro-social behaviors such as empathy, cooperation, and trust, but only towards in-group or kin. And in fact, it could make us more suspicious and negative towards people who aren't considered close to us. Next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. Also, there's another technique of deep brain stimulation, which has, and transcranial magnetic stimulation as well, different types of brain stimulation that has been shown to increase cooperation and neuroplasticity of the brain, meaning to increase the ability for us to learn more. So in theory, we could learn how to be more moral. We could learn how to do more ethical analysis. But the trouble is, of course, is that all these things have some negative side effects too, and may even cause personality changes. They are very effective in dealing with other medical conditions, just like the pharmacological agents, like deep depression or Parkinson's disease, but they're problematic for moral bioenhancement. Next. At the root of it, the meaning of morality is very complicated, and Michael's going to talk a bit more about that with us. But all I want to say is that when we use a quick fix, when we use technology, technology itself seems to promote values of utility and efficiency, and those values may run counter to some Christian values where we're looking more at the intrinsic worth of a person. So we need to look at that very carefully. However, people like James Hughes who's a Buddhist, has made a really compelling argument that potentially these bioenhancements could help some people overcome some neurological barriers that stand in the way of them acting in ways that are consistent with their morality. So it's a mixed thing. And there's another problem around contextuality, because sometimes what is a good moral quality in all situations is not, it doesn't extend across all situations. If we want to decrease aggression, it could be the case that in some situations aggression is a good thing, like being heroic, pushing someone out of the way of an oncoming car. Next slide, please. So here's an example, right? Persson and Sabulescu want to increase empathy. Their argument is, who would not want more empathy? How could more empathy possibly be contentious? Feminist Christian theologians have shown that women and other marginalized groups have had an excessive amount of empathy and self-sacrifice, to the point of not safeguarding themselves, not respecting themselves, not loving themselves. It may be that we could develop empathy, more empathy in other ways that are safer, such as increased spirituality, which is shown to increase our sense of connection to other people. A couple of interesting points for you to read on that slide. Next slide, please. So there's three big theoethical issues that I want to just name really quickly here for you. I'm going to leave it to you to read my slides because I'm running out of time, unfortunately. So the first big issue is what it means to be human and more fully human. So we have to decide what it means for us to be created in the image of God. At what point do we stop being created in the image of God? Is there a point? And at that point, we would draw the limitation on engaging enhancements, that the technology would no longer be actually enhancing us or making us better. So we have to decide what emphasizes connection and makes us more aware of our interdependence, makes us more aware and more sensitive to a preferential option for the poor. Next slide, please. So that whole question of how do we shift from a focus on rights to responsibility? How do we enhance our knowledge about global injustice? So we're going to need to have knowledge about that a quick fix is not going to do it all. We need education as well. Next slide. Okay, there's an example there. I'm going to leave that. Next slide. Choice is the other big issue. We often in our society boil things down to a matter of individual choice. It's if I want it, that should be enough. But from a Christian viewpoint, we have to ask other questions. How will my choice affect other people? Next slide. And distributive justice and being moral. So within Christianity, justice is so very important. There's my little timer. And we need to be aware of the impact of distributive justice on our choices for making us better. Next slide, please. And in the end, Christianity reminds us of the importance of interdependence and the intrinsic value of life, divine sovereignty, and the preferential option for the poor. The Imago Dei confers the responsibility to create as best we can for the good of all life. And the discernment of what is good requires diverse community and moral courage. So this is what we're doing today. We're engaging all of us in this conversation to try to further our exploration of what might be possibly good and redemptive about different ways of morally enhancing ourselves and what might cross that line. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tracy, for leading us into this conversation today. We now have 5 minutes for questions and answers for Tracy, and I would remind participants to please type your questions into the chat box so that we can discuss those questions with Tracy. If I don't get to every question in the order they're typed, we will use the questions for our plenary question and answer after our break. Maybe just to get us started here, Tracy, you raised the idea that the hormone oxytocin might make everyone more altruistic, and then wondered about whether there was a risk for women and marginalized people becoming too altruistic. Or if everyone were to become more altruistic, would that make for a more even moral playing field, so to speak? What do you think about that?
There we go. Okay, thank you, Peter, for that question. This is a question that I pondered a lot. So, okay, I have a concern with trying to make people who tend to be too altruistic and self-sacrificing even more so. And so do many other intersectional Christian theologians. But what if we could bring us all up to the same altruistic level? James Hughes talks about that, and so do Savulesky and Pearson. If we could do that and adjust then so that women would not be any more altruistic than the rest, then maybe it would be a good thing. I'm not sure how we get there and how we get there so it's not a danger. And I certainly wouldn't think we could make ourselves morally better by enhancing ourselves that way unless we did it in tandem with religious education and other education that helps us to understand the world better and the injustices that we have in the world.
Thank you, Tracy. Looking for questions in the chat box, please. If you have a question for Tracy, please type them for us. We will try and get to all the questions if we have time. Well, here's a question from Noel. Is it still altruism if it comes from chemicals? Bioenhancement that comes artificially isn't real at all, or is it? What do you think, Tracy?
That's a really good question, and that is a critique that many theologians are starting to make and come up with, and I think it's an important one. But what counts as being real? What counts as being authentic again? The fact that we develop in many different ways. So by education, is that real? What makes that real as opposed to the moral bioenhancement modalities? It might be other modalities rather than bioenhancements. It might be that you're thinking about effort, right? The role of effort, and that if there is no effort, does it count? Well, maybe it does count, because if it helps get us to a safer, more loving, more moral place, and we don't walk away from the other more traditional, tried and true methods of making ourselves more virtuous, then maybe it becomes real. I guess it depends too on what we think of the meaning of real and authentic.
Thank you, Tracy. There's another question here now from Das Sydney. Are there key qualities which belong to being made in God's image, or is the Imago Dei known only in the actions towards the common good?
Good question, Das. Again, I think there's lots of other key qualities, and if I had time, I would certainly go into them more. So if we take a relational perspective on the Imago Dei, and there are other perspectives that, some that are more focused on rationality, which I have some concern with because they tend to neglect the value of people who do not possess the same cognition. If a relational Imago Dei understanding is embraced, then that really, I think, highlights the critical importance of interdependence in the world. And that's no small thing. So that every choice that I make then has an effect on other people. So how do I engage that level of responsibility? And not just succumb to that social emphasis on my individual rights and what's good for me, but that I push beyond that to a more specifically Christian understanding.
Thank you. We'll take one more question now, Tracy. This one comes from Geert Jan, who says that human progress is realized in groups and different persons have different capacities. Enhancement of individuals is an individualistic approach, isn't it?
Yes, and that's another excellent question that, yes, that some of us have looked at, and I think that you're right on that at the very heart of this conversation is an individualistic ethic. So the role of religion, I think, is definitely partly to push that definition and understanding to a much more deliberate communal engagement. So to say, all right, if our starting point is with the world and in global communities, and we're looking at systemic injustices and patterns of virtue and lack thereof, then how might moral bioenhancements potentially support that collective justice work? I'm aware that I might be more cautiously optimistic that there could be something redemptive about these bioenhancements than many of my colleagues might be. At the same time, I am skeptical too, and I share your reservations, and that we certainly a lot depends on how deliberate we are with this at flipping at the emphasis from the extreme individual to a more communal perspective.
Thank you, Tracy. I think we are out of our question and answer period now for our first panelist. So let's proceed to our second panelist. Michael Buttrey represents the Anglican Church of Canada on our Faith and Life Sciences reference group. He lives with his wife Irene in Toronto, where he is the theologian in residence at St. Clement's Anglican Church. He is a doctoral candidate in Christian ethics at the University of Toronto. And Michael will be comparing biomedical moral enhancement to traditional attempts at creating more ethical or virtuous humans, including looking at moral education, Aristotelian virtue, and Christian virtue. Michael, thank you for being a panelist today.
Thank you, Peter. So I'd like to start with the question of, does moral education make people more ethical? And some scientific studies have said no. For example, the famous Milgram experiment in the 1960s found that ordinary people complied with instructions to administer simulated shocks up to a supposedly dangerous level. A less lethal study of thousands of American school children in the 1970s found a lack of consistent altruism, honesty, and self-control across different situations. Finally, Christians in particular should be concerned about a study at Princeton Seminary that found students who were late to give a talk were less willing to stop and help someone groaning in an alley, even if the subject of their talk was the parable of the Good Samaritan. Apparently, even training to become a pastor doesn't guarantee good character. Now, each of these studies have their problems, which we can talk about at the end if you'd like. But in general, I'm not sure we need better studies to demonstrate that moral education fails sometimes. It's pretty common knowledge. I think a more interesting question is, why is moral education unreliable? Advocates of biomedical moral enhancement, like Persson and Savulescu, say the problem is our biology. They then suggest medical and genetic treatments might be faster and more accessible methods of moral enhancement than traditional moral education. At the same time, they recognize that there is a risk, some critics raise, of BME restricting freedom. They argue that there's no real reason to believe that biomedical moral enhancement, BME, is restrictive of freedom. They put it this way: there's no reason to assume that moral bioenhancement to which children are exposed without their consent would restrict their freedom and responsibility more than a traditional moral education to which they are also exposed without their consent. Personally, I'm unconvinced. I think human freedom is the major reason why traditional moral education is such an unreliable method of producing right action. It is up to each of us in our freedom whether we choose what is right or wrong. And unless that freedom is removed or restricted, it will presumably be a major obstacle for effective moral enhancement as well. We see this same problem with another moral enhancement proposal, Mark Walker's Genetic Virtue Project. He argues that the vices and virtues are at least partially inherited, and if we can identify the genes responsible, we could use genetic selection and engineering to reduce vice and promote virtue. In response to this concern that moral enhancements would be harder to change than moral education and potentially more restrictive of freedom, Walker says that new moral insights could lead to new genetic moral enhancements. You could fix, some moral enhancements that weren't so great with another round. And then he goes on to say, children born with the wrong enhancements could be sent to remedial camps. Walker does not reflect further on this rather chilling suggestion, and he also, I think, does not acknowledge the major difference between education and genetic engineering. An important one is that students who are educated in a certain way may individually choose to resist and reject the moral framework they are given, again, because they have freedom. Whereas individuals who, assuming it's possible, if individuals are engineered to favor a certain morality, they might need the assistance of physicians, geneticists, or pharmaceutical companies to make further changes to their genetic inheritance. Also, even if moral enhancement was freely available, no charge through public health care, which seems unlikely, only some people will have the power, resources, and skills to choose the goals of moral enhancement, design biomedical moral enhancements, and decide who receives them. The same is true, of course, of our medical system today and the availability of drugs throughout the world. In contrast, you could argue then that traditional moral education is much more egalitarian. It can be conducted by anyone and received by anyone, with varying degrees of success, of course. So is there a way to develop moral character that also respects freedom? One possibility is neo-Aristotelian virtue theory, which is a contemporary reimagining of Aristotle. According to one scholar, developing virtues depends not on the circumstances of your life, but how you live it. Your circumstances are things that are not under your control: age, gender, height, family, nationality, language, genetics, presumably. Obviously, these circumstances influence your life and your potential, but the measure of virtue is how skillfully or not you choose to use your raw materials. Like Aristotle, this scholar argues that the virtues are skills, intelligent skills. The brave person is guided by a rational understanding of bravery, understood traditionally as a middle point between cowardice and recklessness. And these skills are initially, yes, learned by imitation from your teachers and peers, but the goal is for the learner in virtue to appropriate and understand it to the point that they can surpass their teacher. Again, there's freedom here, freedom to exercise virtues in different ways than that you are taught. How does this compare to moral enhancement? Well, generally, I'd say that genetics are very much part of your circumstances or raw materials. But if so, then Walker's genetic virtue project could never result in true virtue, because regardless of how much we enhance people's raw materials, they still have the choice of how to use them. Moreover, here's another point on the aspect of freedom. Different students may use the skills they learn in different ways, and the same with virtue. Different virtues may require different responses in different situations. But pharmaceuticals and other medical technologies are usually designed for uniform effects. That's the whole goal, which provides perhaps yet another reason why moral enhancement could actually be more restrictive of freedom than moral education. On the other hand, there are problems with virtue, for sure. One common critique is that virtue is elitist. For Aristotle, one's potential for virtue depended on being born as an intelligent, free man with good parents and a good society. If you lacked those steps up, you are unlikely to become virtuous. Modern scholars, of course, emphasize more how you live your life, making the theory more egalitarian. But it still depends on a certain intellectual capacity. Children are still seen as incapable of virtue because they lack life experience. And people with intellectual disabilities are seen as incapable of virtue because they lack the intellectual capacity for it. Is there an alternative to excluding these groups? Here, I think, is where the Christian virtue tradition holds more promise. Although my time is running out, so I'll keep this short. The Christian theologian with the greatest influence in this tradition is Thomas Aquinas. In his work, Aquinas agrees with Aristotle that the proper end of human life is happiness. But he interprets true happiness as the beatific vision of God. And then he argues that moving toward this happiness requires gifts from God, the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Because these virtues are given, not earned through our own effort, their acquisition does not depend on having certain capacities, meaning that children and people with intellectual disabilities can be virtuous. Now, initially, this may seem to completely deflate the point of ever trying to be virtuous, given that virtue is entirely a gift. Aquinas says, yes, even with grace, fully restoring human nature requires the cooperation of human freedom over time to acquire a facility with virtue. There's both a gift of grace and human effort as a response to it. Some Protestants, of course, were quite suspicious of this. Luther arguing that sanctification requires total human passivity so that God can work in us unhindered. But some Reformed thinkers, such as Augustine, are much more positive about the virtue. Augustine, for example, saw spiritual exercises and industriously checking and lessening greed as good methods of moral and spiritual development. Therefore, I believe both the Reformed and Catholic tradition have resources within them to preserve the motivation for moral improvement, while also understanding the potential for people with disabilities and children to be virtuous. Finally, I think turning our attention to the Christian tradition of virtue helps us identify tensions between different ideas of moral improvement. Biomedical moral enhancement advocates have a certain view of what it means to be moral and what it means to improve our morality. Early Christians, however, celebrated the martyrs. And I doubt that any government agency or pharmaceutical company will fund research into enhancements that encourage martyrdom. Similarly, we might ask if modern parents who are potentially choosing these enhancements will see generosity, radical self-denial, or a passionate commitment to justice as good goals for moral enhancement. Some, I suspect, might perceive these as distractions from achieving a successful life. If so, then even if biomedical moral enhancement can work, there may be limited benefit to Christians who prize a different account of what it means to be good. And I'll stop there for time. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very much for your reflection. Again, a reminder to use the chat boxes to pose your questions. I have a question here from Karen. Doesn't bioenhancement undermine natural transformative possibility? Rather than being surprised by grace, folks are simply awaiting, quote, appropriate bio-tweaking. Isn't that sad?
Yes, that's a fair point. I think certainly if we see moral enhancement as a solution to every moral limitation that we ourselves experience, that's a real failure of determination and faith and hope. I suppose I should say something more positive about moral enhancement, though, and that is that there could be an analogy to the use of pharmacology in treating depression, right? The goal is, as far as I understand it, a cooperation between the power of drugs to remedy natural imbalances in the brain and the hard work we all have to do to live life in challenging situations, right? Which can be made impossible by biological abnormalities. So I think in that paradigm, you can understand the use of some of these drugs for medical purposes. But of course, for moral enhancement advocates, they're suggesting everyone might benefit from that. And that's where I think I, at least, see some problems.
Thank you, Michael. Going a bit higher in the chat box, I see a comment from Noel who appreciated your point about the economics of bioenhancement. I mean, industries could be producing these chemicals or technologies, and if it's just a business, is it actually bioenhancement, or will it be unevenly distributed to further less than altruistic goals? Any thoughts about that?
Absolutely. And we know, of course, that the pharmaceutical industry has also developed a practice of inventing, I'm putting in scare quotes, maladies that they can then target with marketing to address using new drugs. There may be a strong imbalance, I suspect, between what is actually good for us as a society and what pharmaceutical companies can make money off of.
Michael, at the start of your presentation, you mentioned several studies that question whether people can truly be trained to become more moral or more virtuous. And you said that there were some problems with those studies. Can you provide a couple more details about what some of the problems were? Sure.
I mean, I think these studies are kind of fun, but I wouldn't take them as a declarative statement on the potential of human beings for morality. I mean, a study of school children should probably find a lack of consistent character because, of course, children are young, right? We think of education as a way to help them learn not only facts about the world, but how to live well, and that takes time. Of course, it doesn't always succeed, but still, I think in children in particular, you should give a lot of grace to that. The Princeton Seminary one is a little more challenging, you know, when I think of my own experience as a seminary and what we're doing in theological education. I think the one argument I might make is that seminary students who passed by someone groaning in an alley are A, students, so again, there's something that we're trying to teach them to work in their character, and B, they may have thought that their obligation to their fellow students, their professor, outweighed the obligation to help a bystander. And that's not necessarily solely their fault. It's also a question of how do we structure our education so that we think, you know, performance is more important than being a good person, right? That's not really excusing them, but sort of spreading the blame around to the whole institution of theological education, if I can do that.
Thank you. A question from Katerina. would not the population most interested in moral biotherapy inherently be those with already more moral tendencies? How would those who choose to behave immorally, and thus those who would benefit most from the therapy, be encouraged to receive the therapy?
That's a great question. I mean, unfortunately, some advocates of biomedical moral enhancement basically adopt an authoritarian stance, right? We're going to have to give it to people freely to start with, but if we find some people really need it and they're not willing to take it, then we're going to have to coerce them into taking it, or make it, so that you can't really opt out. Yeah, I think failing that, you're not going to have the kind of uptake you want. But this isn't a defense. Again, it's a good way of spreading the blame around. We already do this in a certain sense, in that we already believe that there are certain conditions in which you can be institutionalized against your will, prescribed certain medications. I'm not saying that's wrong in every case. It's just that this is an extension of that logic, right? We say that, okay, it's not just that you have a medical problem, a psychiatric disorder perhaps, you have a moral problem. And of course, that excuse has been used to institutionalize people for decades for various moral failings that actually have no medical basis.
Michael, thank you very much for furthering our thinking on this subject today. We're very grateful. Our third speaker today is Dr. Moira McQueen. And just to let the webinar participants know, Moira's slides will be available via a link that you will find in the chat panel from Rebecca. So please look in your chat panel for a link to Moira's slides. So Dr. Moira McQueen is a graduate in law from the University of Glasgow in Scotland and worked for several years as a lawyer. After her Master's of Divinity degree from the Faculty of Theology, University of St. Michael's College, and the Toronto School of Theology, she graduated with a PhD in moral theology, also from St. Michael's, where she has been teaching moral theology since 1994. In 2004, she was appointed the Executive Director of the Canadian Catholic Bioethics Institute with a mandate to conduct research and education in bioethics from a Catholic perspective. She is the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops representative to our Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group here at the Canadian Council of Churches. Moira, thank you very much for helping us conclude our webinar panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Peter. Oh, good. It looks as if I'm straight into the slides. So my part is dealing, if you would go to the first slide, please, after the introduction. I'm very, very interested in artificial intelligence. It's obviously with us to stay. And anything to do with computers and our development as humans has become a really important ethical topic. And so this question of biomedical moral enhancement, biotechnological moral enhancement is something that is really growing. And Tracy has talked about deep brain stimulation. And it and artificial intelligence, in this sense that artificial intelligence can just think so fast, medically speaking, can make diagnoses, etc., pretty accurately and certainly much faster than people. The speed part, the machine learning part, is something that we have to become more familiar with in terms of helping us, especially in my case, really thinking mostly about medical problems. The question of moral enhancement, of course, is very difficult to navigate, as both Tracy and Michael have indicated. And even from an ethical point of view, using artificial intelligence, ethical problems have already been identified, such as problems of bias. The old story of what information is being fed into something or somebody and who is doing the feeding. The question that cognitive enhancement can be increased has definitely already been shown. But again, from my perspective, thinking about it, not so much through drugs or any other kind of stimulation, through deep brain stimulation, because it does work, could be incredibly useful for people with the dementias, for example. But the question of whether this brain-to-computer link could lead to moral enhancement is something that's espoused by Savulescu and Persons. My two preceding speakers have talked about those ethicists, and Kevin Warwick and Elon Musk. And the thing about Warwick is that he actually has had a chip inserted into his brain. Really, he's thinking about it more from the cognitive enhancement, the use of intelligence, a way to negotiate a lot of medical problems. It could obviously help people who have to use wheelchairs, for example. A brain signal could open a door. He actually experienced that with the chip he had implanted in his arm at first, and doors would open, lights would go on in his classroom, all those kinds of things. Really quite wonderful at that level. Brain implants, perhaps slightly different. And Elon Musk is really, somebody mentioned money. I think there is very much a vision of making some money, making profits out of developing these techniques. But I think a key point that he does emphasize is that because artificial intelligence is here to stay, that we have to learn how to interface with it, perhaps not exactly through brain chips, but that's exactly what these two people are thinking. Could I have the next slide, please? So we can see that we can use it to improve health. So enhancement in itself can be good in terms of robotic limbs, that kind of thing. But both Warwick and Musk and Savulescu and other people see the capacity for improving humanity, which is a very different thing from physical enhancement, that the pursuit of cognitive improvement for health reasons, the question then becomes pursuing cognitive improvement for its own sake. And my next slide is this question of, can we make people more moral? There is no doubt that we need to be better people with a greater capacity for morality. I don't think anybody would deny that. And those of us who are teaching ethics and studying ethics belong to that group. We agree, and we're trying to do that ourselves. Some people, such as Savulescu, actually thinks that we lack the will, we lack the moral nous to move ahead to save us from catastrophe. And Savulescu in particular is thinking about how we don't seem to be prepared to move towards improving in the climate change realm, despite the fact that we know so many predictions have been made as to what will happen if we don't follow suit. And the idea then is that enhancing people through bioenhancement, that might save us as a race. And my next slide, please. Very briefly says that it could enhance intellectual performance if there are natural limitations. But one of my basic points in this whole area is that we already have a different starting point as individuals. We all have different capacities, cognitive and otherwise. And I can't help but think that even if all of us were taken up to the same level of thinking morally, there is no reason that in itself would guarantee that we would all agree about moral issues. It's never been the history of the world, and I don't really see the fact that we're all at the same intellectual level would change that. It might make for better arguments, slightly more rational, but I'm not convinced that it would lead us to the same point of saying something is right and something is wrong. And my next slide, please. Really, maybe you could just read through these points quite quickly, because each one of them raises a fairly significant possible challenge. It raises the question of eugenics, the idea that we might then, if it were possible through some kind of stimulation, either inserting a chip in a fetus's brain or a newborn's brain, then is there some way we could actually improve their cognitive and moral capacity? And you can see that could possibly lead to a selection of the best fetus, the best embryo, that kind of thing. Would parents be obligated to use this type of enhancement if, for example, they were not behaving in the schoolyard? That kind of question. And my next slide. For me, the Christian response is of great significance, of course. And one of my major questions about any kind of enhancement from the outside, so to speak, so as in being plugged into a computer, as Kevin Warwick does, having a brain chip, is, who would be controlling that? the essence of being an acting moral person for everybody, I think it's a universal, but Christianity emphasizes this, is that we have the free will to make our own moral choices, that God has gifted us with this capacity for working out what is right and what is wrong, and not that we always follow what is right, even when we know that it's right, but the important thing is we have this capacity both for working out right and wrong, and also choosing to follow the paths that they outline for us. So the maintenance of free will to me is vital. I see a little danger if we were all to be truly enhanced, that there would be a danger of striving for superiority. If the economics question was brought up before too, not everybody could maybe afford or be eligible for this type of enhancement, and it could form a sort of elite class. It reminds me a little bit of Margaret Atwood's work, which I think is very much on the money in these areas. There's a danger of the desire to be even better, even faster, so a competitiveness that isn't necessarily, there's a healthy competitiveness, but we all know of the other kind of competitiveness that leads some people to destroy their own character and sometimes other people's. And then there is also always the question that it doesn't always work. I mean, we won't know that until this has actually started to be done on a much wider circle of people than is already happening. And my last slide is just a continuation of a more Christian response, and Tracy and Michael have already mentioned it, of course, that fundamental to our belief system in terms of our moral activity is that we are made in God's image. And that we've always thought that that is the bottom line, that that in itself guarantees inherent human dignity. So the question of being better or being made to be better, in my mind, contradicts that very much. So I don't have a problem with biotechnology when we're talking about physical enhancements, so the areas that I list here in the slide. But I do have this particular problem if it's being used in the hope of making us morally better. It implies moral judgment that at the minute we're not okay, and sometimes we don't make the best moral decisions. But the leader of my church has that wonderful phrase of do not judge. And he means there in terms of an individual's capacity that we really don't know exactly the circumstances of that person, and that the person has this inherent dignity that is the guarantor, along with this moral freedom of conscience, as the person's dignity and in fact his inherent human worth. So for all these reasons that I see, there could be great potential in some of these biotechnological enhancements. I think it's important to look at the question marks around them as well.
Moira, thank you very much for being our concluding panelist today. Looking at questions here in the chat boxes, there's a question here from Gil. Gil writes, Moira, how do you see the relationship of enhancement to conversion?
Oh, I wonder if Jill means moral enhancement. I think it would be a wonderful follow-through if we were able to be enhanced, and in my mind here, I'm not thinking so much biotechnologically as I am thinking of Michael's point of the virtues, Thomistic teaching, which I teach and Jill knows, that then that kind of enhancement, that kind of further education is something that I think would really, in fact, in many cases does lead, maybe not to a knocked off one's horse type conversion, but to an ongoing conversion where one becomes ever clearer about the pursuit of the good. And I think in Thomistic teaching, the pursuit of happiness, and in what he is really saying is that we are destined towards our final end, that end being towards God. So that kind of enhancement has to be positive.
Okay. Thank you. There's a question from Christina who asked, what is the conversation about moral bioenhancements and their effects on global diplomacy? enhancements being individual things that people can do, and many human problems being the problems of groups of human beings. So how might moral bioenhancements affect war, the United Nations, world relief?
Oh, that's a great question. My goodness, I've never thought globally like that before. You know, if there's any group that I might actually say, and perhaps this is a little bit politically incorrect, that could use moral enhancement, whether bio or academic enhancement, I think it might be something like United Nations. There is no doubt that in many ways, and perhaps this is my personal bias and it's not coming from artificial intelligence, that in many areas the moral workings out, the moral decisions that come from that particular group aren't always what I would think should be coming from a body that represents the world, you know, they really have global representatives. I think what happens so often is, as usual, perhaps, that politics get in the way of morality, and it always seems in so many areas, and I'm not denying that there's a lot of good done by different bodies from United Nations, but I think we can see, even in terms of who's just been voted into the Security Council, that politics in that sense, pragmatic politics, plays such a huge role. To me anyway, as I said, this is very much a personal opinion, but just in following some of the activities, it seems to me that the moral aspect very much takes a back seat. And as a optimistic person, I mean, I would have to add that one's politics, as everything else that one does, is really only as good as one's morals, individually and globally. I'm not sure if that answers the question, which was a great question. I'd need to reflect on it.
Thank you. A question from Lucy. Why differentiate between physical enhancements and moral enhancements? What are the parallels, and how can reflecting on moral enhancement help us to think through the dangers of physical enhancements?
Well, that's another really good question, of course. But here, I mean, talking about biotechnological enhancement and biotechnological moral enhancement, I think is a slightly different category from just talking about enhancement, physical enhancement morally. So again, it depends on what we're using to do it. And when we're making moral decisions, what we use to do it, the means by which we do something, is very much a factor of the morality of it. So I'm very much in favor of enhancement, physical enhancement, assuming that the person agrees, assuming that it's, I do think using deep brain stimulation, so for the dementias, and that does change behavior, but it's changing more social behavior usually than moral behavior. So I see the sort of dichotomy between using enhancements for the better of the person at a physical level, and in fact in dementias, for example, it may raise the cognitive function as well. But for me, the dividing line between that and any kind of biotechnological moral enhancement is the question of free will. The person being a moral agent already, the person having the capacity and God-given conscience to decide between right and wrong and be able to follow that with nobody imposing it from the outside. The imposition to me is the problem, with somebody else thinking this is the way Moira should be, so we will alter her with this brain chip to make Moira go in such and such a direction. I think that to me is a real problem in terms of conscience, personal responsibility, and actually dignity of the person.
Thank you, Moira. Welcome to the plenary question and answer part of our webinar, where questions can be posed to all the panelists or to individual panelists. And again, please write your questions in the chat panel. Let's see here. Here's a question from James to everyone, to any or all the speakers. Have interventions such as chips or devices or pharmaceuticals or behavior programs been tested with current good clinical trials methodology? Should this be done? Can this even be done? For example, there were Christians who tried to test the clinical efficacy of prayer about 20 years ago, but some, including me, argue that prayer by its very nature can't be tested through clinical trials. In light of such past attempts, is testing prayer, can or should interventions to enhance Christian moral character and or behavior be tested through well-done clinical trials? Panelists?
Well, yes, has to be the very fast answer to that. There should be clinical trials, and there are clinical trials. Tracy's probably more aware of them from the drug point of view. Certainly in the area that I'm talking about, not too many people volunteer to have brain chips implanted. So Kevin Warwick is going at this very, very carefully, but with a research team with him. So it's not just a gambit. It's not something really that he wants to do for its own sake. He is thinking about it in terms of medical enhancement, almost more, I think, than moral enhancement, although he has both arguments going. But I absolutely agree. I mean, every other substance has to be tested clinically on real people. And so I foresee that my sort of aspect of brain chips will be more than likely, unless there's a fantastic way of insertion that causes minimal danger, will take quite some time. Any other way of doing anything that involves the human body is completely irresponsible.
Other panelists want to weigh in?
It's complicated. How's that for a good beginning response? It's less complicated doing trials and research on physical enhancements, and the debate around what we consider to be a physical enhancement, making us better, or a therapy that brings us up to whatever we consider to be normal and acceptable is a big debate too. But in terms of what constitutes, right, a virtue, what constitutes being more moral, there's so many debates around that. I'm not sure. I think it's going to be a while before we get to clinical trials to assess exactly how to help people be more moral, more virtuous. And that's what really worries some researchers, because we see what's going on in the world today. We see even what's going on south of the border, and we worry, I think, collectively about things like racialization and violence against groups of people, and how that might become much worse with the added abilities to be able to attack people through AI, through any number of means that we're creating technologically. So I think that Savulescu has a point there. I find it quite concerning. So is it good enough for us to say that we each get to choose, right, how to be moral? And there is a certain virtue, I think, to trusting that we do have the capacity and that we ought to take responsibility for that. At the same time, we've got so many social messages coming at us all the time that affect our choices. So what counts as an authentic choice, a choice that is real to me, versus a choice that is totally shaped and influenced by so many countless cultural messages? And how do we sift through that? And at what point do we say, no, that cultural message is highly problematic, and how do we challenge it? Well, I know we challenge some of those messages within our faith communities, and that's incredibly important. But how else can we challenge those messages to truly help people to access and know what it is that's of value to them? And that's where I spend a lot of time talking with my students about that, because I don't think we spend enough time really deliberately looking at what our values are. And until we know that, we can't really choose how to make ourselves morally better.
If I could just jump right back in there, just on that it's such an important point, how do we know what our values are, which is the task of ethics. And then, so with my students and with yours, Tracy, we have to go through a whole sort of session of systematic ethical principles and different ethical schemes, trying to work out which come to better conclusions than others. And again, it doesn't mean that we all ever come out on the same platform, which is really quite fascinating. because there are so many ethical theories to choose from, if you like. And so it means a really deep brain stimulation of students, all of us actually, to see the pluses and the minuses, even in the ethical arguments themselves, before we come to applying them in any specific situation. And that is, you know, in terms of testing and all that sort of thing, that to me is something that is really rather problematic. On the other hand, Thomas Aquinas just talks about that natural inherent understanding of the good, and he was not meaning that as a religious point, he was meaning it as a universal. And that's what I sort of mean when I talk about that inherent capacity. You know, 3- and 4-year-olds know that something is wrong. They'll say it's not fair. They're using justice terms when they don't know the word justice, but they understand just in the interrelationality of people, you know, what looks good and what looks bad. That sounds pretty simplistic, but just to illustrate that idea that there is a capacity within us. And you're also, I think you're very right in what you were saying about that capacity, and conscious thinking can be dulled by some of the, you know, the sort of the cultural aspects and the, what I sometimes call the sort of lowest common denominator aspects of society that so many of us end up being stuck with and in. But, and so, yeah, it's definitely an ongoing problem just to assess values, and yet we have to do it. I mean, that's the bottom line for anybody in ethics. Everybody has to make decisions. Everybody has to make choices. And we all do it with the capacity that we have. And from that point of view, I would really like to see that moral capacity being expanded, but not necessarily by either biotechnological means or otherwise.
Michael, did you want to weigh in?
Maybe just briefly that, you know, in addition to what Moira and Tracy have both pointed out, there's maybe a question of applying science to try and measure the moral quality of persons. It's probably a misapplication of a tool, right? It's not fit for that purpose because there's no consensus on what constitutes, say, a just action or not. And B, our actions always arise from reasons within the person. And so it's not the kind of thing where you can simply like look at people objectively and say, okay, this person is moral and this person is immoral. Someone may make a difficult choice because they understand a situation on a deeper level than perhaps another choice that might be based on a facile understanding. And then that you get into all sorts of, you know, deeper contextual problems that science is arguably unable to measure in the way that you would have to this kind of study.
Thank you. I want to move on to a question from Paul, and I'm going to paraphrase the question a little bit here. Paul writes that it seems it's one thing to enhance an organ system to make it function at its maximum human capacity, and another factor to super enhance an organ system. For instance, we use glasses to help eyes to see like eyes should see, but what if glasses were to make us to be able to see better than eagles, or hearing aids help us to hear as good as human hearers can hear, but what if hearing aids would make us hear better than dogs could hear? Paul goes on to write, related to Moira's speaking about helping people with dementia to function better cognitively, isn't this along the same lines, helping our brains to function better than they're designed to? Doesn't this relate to the whole issue of human nature as created and designed by God, albeit through a long evolutionary process? Panelists, any comments about that?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, okay.
Question. Thank you for that. I've got you got my mind spinning in so many different directions there. Yeah, so the question of what constitutes a human nature, right? We keep changing and we keep developing new ways that become accepted as part of human nature that weren't before. Take heart surgery, right? Before the 50s, heart surgery would have been considered completely shocking and contrary, more than likely, to God's will, messing with, tampering with the sacred. So, but now it's very normal, thank goodness. So how do we decide what is part of our human co-creating through God for the good? How do we decide what the good is? Very, very complex questions. I apologize for that ringing in the background. I think that's all I need to say for now.
Yeah, it's it's a really interesting question. It really takes me back anyway to this question of, it's like, how far should we go kind of question. What enhancements are possible, and why should we, or when should we take advantage of them? And I guess I mean, the physical enhancement one, I really don't think I have a problem with at all, assuming, though I suppose then it is a question mark already, that it is for the benefit of the individual receiving it. So, you know, the questions that arose in the Olympics or the Paralympics when somebody had bionic feet and other people didn't, and then that was judged to be unjust because that poor person had no feet. I mean, the bionic feet were his feet. And then it becomes, we all begin to get into this slightly competitive mode about, you know, well, he's enhanced more than I'm enhanced, that kind of thing. And yet that's exactly what that person needed to be able to walk, to be able to run. It brought him up to capacity. And then in a sense, according to other people, it gave that person an unfair advantage. So I think it takes a lot of moral maturity to be able just to accept that kind of thing, but it's already based on a human limitation that is correctable. And I think there are very few of us who would reject something that brought us up to the best that we could be, and by that I mean physically. On the moral enhancement or the cognitive enhancement, I really do see as something that would be wonderful for many people whose cognitive capacity has declined. And I think that's very different then from talking about sort of trying to improve somebody's cognitive capacity to make them, I think you used the word superhuman. I think if that's the aim, it's wrong in itself. All these enhancements are really, in my mind anyway, for the person's own benefit, to bring the person to capacity. And it's true that we evolve, so maybe we are a lot more capable of doing things than, you know, eons ago. But that was a very slow and natural evolution rather, quite different, I think, from introducing something like biotechnology. Again, with the question of who would receive it and how it would be administered. But it's a real, the superhuman question reminds me really of, you know, George Bernard Shaw, that idea of striving towards almost the impossible. And I think that might be problematic in itself.
I'm going to ask one last question from the webinar group, and this is from David. David says that we know the problems of algorithms is that those who code the algorithm build in their own biases, sometimes even racist biases. Like the internet began as a way to enhance social connections. How can we safeguard against bias and the takeover of corporate, for-profit, or other malicious interests that can lead to the kind of unintended consequences we see in algorithms and social media today? Panelists?
I'm doing too much talking, I think. You know, I don't think you can get rid of bias. I think bias, we can become aware of bias, and then if we're talking about a machine, then it can be set to deal with that. The algorithms can be altered. But we always seem to come back to that fundamental question of, again, who's doing the alteration? You know, it comes back to the human and our particular content every single time. I don't know what Michael and Tracy think, but I can't get away from the idea that just by being human, we have our biases. They can be pointed out to us, but that are what are called unconscious biases, all those kinds of things. I think it's part of being human, and I see that as maybe not an insurmountable problem, but a difficult one to handle.
Tracy, Michael, any last thoughts?
If I can back up slightly to Paul's comments, actually.
Sure.
Just thinking about first Paul Flyman. You know, maybe another way of phrasing this question is, what's the difference between eyeglasses, like I wear, to improve our vision, and metaphorical rose-colored glasses that drug or moral enhancement that would enforce a sort of seeing people in better light, right? And I think the case of dementia is helpful because in many cases, we can have medical treatments that will have moral benefits, but sort of as a side effect, right? The goal is not to make people morally better, but rather to address some kind of medical condition, impairment, deficiency problem they have, and that will then have knock-on effects in the rest of their life. Whereas seeming to enforce like a moral improvement seems to, in my mind at least, reach much deeper into who we are, right? And risks turning our moral judgments into a kind of black and white medical problem. And then I think that's what Paul Ladussier is getting at, in that moral disagreements, I think, are actually an important part of human society. I think something would be lost if we could not disagree on what we think is morally best. Not to say that, obviously all answers are good, some are better than more others, but so the risk then, I think, is that the idea of the rose-colored glasses could be a way to reach into the person and scrub out a bunch of moral disagreements that we've just described as medical problems, when in fact they're maybe an essential part of human freedom.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to claim moderator's privilege at this point. We are at 5:25, 5 minutes left in our webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. I would like to thank all our presenters today, Tracy, Moira, and Michael, for helping us think about moral bioenhancement from a Christian perspective, for challenging our thinking. We are grateful that you have shared your knowledge, your insight, and your wisdom with us today. I'd like to thank all those who have made this webinar technically possible. In particular, I want to say a deep thank you to Dr. Nicole Rokas, the Director of Communications for our Canadian Council of Churches, and also to Rebecca Ivanov, our Faith and Life Sciences Reference Group Admin Coordinator. And thank you, Peter Notaboom, for bringing greetings on behalf of the Canadian Council of Churches and for inspiring us to trial a new form of communication for our reference group. Thank you to all the members of the reference group for participating and for making today possible. And thank you, participants who've gathered from across Canada. I know we have participants from out west and from northern Canada and from all across eastern Canada. Thank you for joining us today. We're grateful that you took this time to be with us and trust that it has been an informative time. Is there anything you'd like to say to the remaining webinar participants?
I hope they were interested, and I can, one always hopes that, and there are so many references and YouTube, videos to watch that we can, I think we're going to send some information, some further information out. Is that correct, Peter?
I think we will certainly have slides going out, and we'll certainly be contacting people with future webinar topics. And if people would like more information, we will certainly try and find more information to continue the conversation.
Yes, I say thank you as well to everybody for all the wonderful questions, for the thoughtful engagement. It's a real pleasure to be able to have these kind of conversations. I think bringing these topics into the public square and engaging Christianity is of the utmost importance.
Well said. Peter, I saw a question, I think maybe from your daughter, asking all four of us if we would be willing to be morally bioenhanced if it were safe and available. You need to talk to her.
We'll have that conversation offline.